The winter of 1873 came early to the Montana Territory, sweeping down from the northern peaks like a hungry wolf. Snow fell in thick curtains across the pine forests, burying the wagon trails that carved through the wilderness like old scars. The wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying with it the promise of a brutal season ahead. Margaret Sullivan pulled her worn wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Her hands, once soft from tending house in Ohio, were now cracked and bleeding from digging in the frozen earth. She had just finished burying her husband, Thomas, marking his grave with a simple wooden cross fashioned from the broken wheel spokes of their wagon. "Mama?" Little James tugged at her skirt, his 5-year-old face pinched with cold and confusion. "When is Papa coming back?" Margaret's heart clenched. She knelt in the snow, pulling her son close. "Papa's gone to heaven. Sweet boy, it's just us now." The attack had come 3 days ago. Bandits, desperate men driven to violence by the harsh frontier, had descended upon their small wagon train like ravens on carrion. Thomas had fought bravely, his rifle cracking in the dawn light. But there had been too many. Margaret could still hear the terrible sound of the bullet that took him, could still see the surprise in his eyes as he fell. Now, the other wagons were gone, their fellow travelers either dead or scattered to the winds. Margaret had hidden with James beneath their overturned wagon during the worst of it, pressing her hand over his mouth to muffle his cries. When silence finally fell, she emerged to find their world destroyed. The bandits had taken everything of value: the horses, most of their supplies, even Thomas's good boots. She stood slowly, her legs trembling from exhaustion and cold. The nearest settlement, Cedar Falls, lay somewhere beyond the mountains to the west. Thomas had studied the maps carefully, showing her the route. 20 miles through Blackfoot Pass, he'd said, his finger tracing the path. 2 days' walk in good weather. But this wasn't good weather, and she had a child to carry. Margaret salvaged what she could from the wreckage: a bag of cornmeal, some dried beans, a dented pot, Thomas's rifle with a handful of cartridges, and their family Bible. She wrapped James in every piece of clothing she could find, turning him into a small, waddling bundle. The rest she packed into a canvas sack, slinging it over her shoulder. "We're going on an adventure," she told James, forcing a smile. "We're going to walk through the mountains like the brave explorers in your picture book." They set off as the sun climbed weakly through the gray clouds. The snow was knee-deep in places, and Margaret had to lift James whenever they encountered drifts. Her skirts, heavy with moisture, dragged behind her like anchors. Within an hour, her legs burned with effort, and sweat froze on her skin. The forest pressed close on all sides, ancient pines groaning under the weight of snow. Every shadow could hide danger: wolves, bears, or worse, more men like those who had killed Thomas. Margaret kept the rifle close, though her hands shook too much to aim properly. By midday, they had covered perhaps 3 miles. James whimpered constantly now, his little body shivering despite the layers. Margaret's own feet had gone numb in her thin boots. She found a fallen log swept clear of snow and sat heavily, pulling James onto her lap. "Hungry, Mama," he whispered. She gave him a handful of cornmeal mixed with snow, watching him eat the meager paste with guilty eyes. Their food would last perhaps 4 days if she was careful. But at this pace, crossing the mountains would take a week or more. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Margaret heard it, the distinctive howl of wolves, somewhere in the distance but moving closer. Fear shot through her like lightning. She struggled to her feet, hauling James up despite his protests. "We need to find shelter," she muttered, scanning the darkening forest. There, a cluster of rocks forming a shallow cave. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She gathered pine needles and dead branches, her fingers clumsy with cold. The matches were damp from snow, and it took precious minutes to coax a flame to life. The fire was pitifully small, barely enough to warm their hands. But it was something. Night fell like a black curtain. The wolves howled again, closer now, Margaret could see their eyes glinting in the darkness beyond the firelight, circling, waiting. She held the rifle across her knees. James pressed against her side. "Tell me a story." "Mama," James whispered. "About Papa." Margaret's throat tightened. "Your Papa was the bravest man in Ohio. He could shoot a squirrel from 100 yards and build anything with his hands. He loved you more than all the stars in the sky. More than the moon? More than the moon and sun combined." The fire began to die, the wood too wet to burn properly. Margaret fed it the last of their kindling, knowing that when it went out, they would be at the mercy of the cold and the wolves. She prayed silently, desperately, to a God who seemed to have abandoned them in this frozen wilderness. It was then that she heard it, a sound different from the wolves or wind. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow. Margaret raised the rifle with trembling hands, pointing it toward the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. "Stay back, I'm armed." The footsteps stopped. Then, from the shadows beyond the dying fire, emerged a figure that made her blood freeze. He was massive, broader than any man she'd ever seen, dressed in a bearskin coat that made him appear even larger. A thick beard covered most of his face, ice crystals glinting in the tangled hair. His eyes, reflecting the firelight, seemed to glow like a predator's. He carried a long rifle easily in one hand, as if it weighed nothing. Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger. "I said stay back!" The mountain man studied her with those unsettling eyes, taking in the pathetic fire, the shivering child, the rifle shaking in her grip. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl, rough from disuse, carrying the wild accent of one who'd lived too long away from civilization. "That fire'll be dead in an hour. You'll be dead an hour after that." "We'll manage," Margaret said, though she knew it was a lie. He took a step closer, and she could smell him now. Wood smoke, bear grease, and something wild and dangerous. The wolves had gone silent, as if even they feared this man. "Where's your man?" he asked. "Dead. Bandits. 3 days past." Something flickered in his eyes. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. He looked at James, who peered out from behind Margaret's skirts with wide, frightened eyes. "You alone? No others coming?" Margaret lifted her chin. "We're heading to Cedar Falls. We don't need help." The mountain man laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. "Cedar Falls is 5 days through these mountains in good weather. You got food for 5 days? Strength to carry the boy when the drifts get deeper? Know which passes are clear and which'll avalanche soon as you sneeze?" Margaret said nothing, her silence answer enough. He moved then, faster than a man his size should be able to. Before she could react, he'd knocked the rifle aside and loomed over her, close enough that she could see the scars crisscrossing his face, the wildness that had taken root in him. "Your body is mine until I have my son's," he growled, the words hanging in the frozen air like a pronouncement of doom. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run. But where could she run? Into the waiting jaws of wolves? Into the killing cold of the mountain night? James whimpered, pressing closer to her skirts. It was that sound, that small expression of fear from her child, that held her still. Whatever this wild man intended, her son needed warmth, shelter, food. Pride and propriety were luxuries she could no longer afford. The mountain man stepped back, seeming to read her thoughts. "You come with me, or you die here. Choose." Margaret looked down at James, at his pale face and blue lips. Then she looked back at the mountain man, this creature who seemed more beast than human, and made the only choice a mother could make. "We'll come," she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. The mountain man nodded once, then turned and began gathering her pitiful supplies. He kicked snow over the dying fire and slung her pack over his massive shoulder as if it weighed nothing. "Keep up," he growled, and started into the forest. Margaret lifted James, her arms already aching, and followed the broad back disappearing into the darkness. Behind them, the wolves began to howl again, a mournful sound that seemed to mark the end of everything she had known and the beginning of something terrifying and unknown. The Montana wilderness swallowed them whole. 3 figures against the vastness of winter. A wild man who moved like he owned these mountains. A desperate woman who had traded one form of captivity for another. And a small boy who didn't understand that his world had just changed forever. The journey through the frozen forest seemed endless. Margaret's arms burned from carrying James, but the mountain man never slowed his pace. He moved through the darkness as if guided by some inner compass, his massive form breaking trail through the deep snow. After what felt like hours, he finally stopped at the base of a steep ridge. "Give me the boy," he commanded, his voice rough in the silence. Margaret clutched James tighter. "I can carry him." The mountain man turned, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "You can barely carry yourself. Give him here, or we'll all freeze." With trembling hands, Margaret passed her son to the wild man. James whimpered but was too exhausted to protest as the mountain man tucked him inside his bearskin coat like a cub. Then, without warning, he grabbed Margaret's wrist with his free hand. "Hold on and don't let go. Ground's treacherous here." They climbed, up and up through trees so thick the moonlight barely penetrated. Margaret's feet slipped constantly on hidden ice, but each time the mountain man's grip kept her upright. Her legs shook with exhaustion. Her lungs burned with each frozen breath, but still they climbed. Finally, as dawn painted the sky a pale gray, they emerged into a small clearing. There, built against the mountain face, stood a log cabin. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney, and the sight of it nearly brought Margaret to her knees with relief. The mountain man pushed open the heavy door and ushered them inside. The warmth hit Margaret like a physical force, making her skin sting as feeling returned. She blinked in the dim light, taking in her surroundings. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with thick log walls chinked with mud and moss. Animal pelts covered much of the walls. Bear, wolf, elk, and others she couldn't identify. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, flames crackling behind an iron grate. The furniture was rough-hewn but sturdy. A table, 2 chairs, a bench, and in the corner, a bed piled with furs. The mountain man set James down near the fire and shrugged off his coat, revealing a frame even more imposing than the furs had suggested. His buckskin shirt stretched across broad shoulders, and his arms were thick as tree trunks. Scars marked his hands and what she could see of his neck, old wounds that spoke of a violent life. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to the bench. "Boy needs food." Margaret sank onto the bench, pulling James into her lap. The child was barely conscious, his lips still tinged blue. The mountain man moved to a corner where supplies hung from the rafters: dried meat, sacks of flour and beans, strings of wild onions. He cut chunks of venison and dropped them into an iron pot, adding water from a bucket. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. Finding her voice, he glanced at her, seeming surprised by the question. Josiah Reed." "I'm Margaret Sullivan. This is James." Josiah grunted, returning to his cooking. Soon the smell of stewing meat filled the cabin, making Margaret's stomach clench with hunger. When it was ready, he ladled the broth into wooden bowls, setting them roughly on the table. "Eat." Margaret fed James first, spooning the hot broth between his lips until color returned to his cheeks. Only then did she eat, trying not to wolf down the food like an animal. It was simple fare: venison, wild onions, and some root vegetables she didn't recognize, but it tasted better than anything she'd eaten in days. Josiah watched them eat in silence, his dark eyes unreadable. When they finished, he stood abruptly. "Boy sleeps there." He pointed to a pile of furs near the fire. "You sleep there." He indicated the bed in the corner. Margaret's chest tightened. "Where will you sleep?" "I don't sleep much." He moved to the door, taking his rifle. "Don't try to run. Wolves are thick this winter, and the nearest help is 5 days off. You wouldn't make it a mile." With that, he disappeared into the gray dawn, leaving Margaret alone with her son in this strange sanctuary. She settled James among the furs, his small body finally warm and fed. He fell asleep instantly, exhaustion claiming him. Margaret sat beside him, fighting her own fatigue as she tried to make sense of their situation. The cabin, now that she could examine it properly, showed signs of long habitation. Tools hung neatly on the walls: axes, knives, traps of various sizes. Shelves held supplies for surviving winter: salt, flour, dried beans, preserved foods in clay jars. Everything spoke of harsh practicality, of a life stripped down to its bare essentials. But there were other things too, things that didn't fit. On a high shelf, almost hidden, she spotted books, real books with the leather bindings. A piece of carved wood sat on the mantel, a half-finished figure of what might have been a horse. These hints of a gentler life made her wonder who Josiah Reed had been before the wilderness claimed him. Exhaustion finally overtook her. Margaret curled up on the bed, which smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. Despite her fear, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, warmth and weariness pulled her into sleep. She woke to the sound of wood being split. Through the cabin's single window, she saw Josiah working in the clearing, his axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. Without his coat, she could see the power in his movements, the way his muscles bunched and released with each swing. He worked like a man possessed, creating a pile of firewood tall as himself. James stirred by the fire. "Mama, where are we?" "We're safe," she said, going to him. "Are you hungry?" As if summoned by her words, Josiah entered, arms full of split wood. He stacked it by the fireplace without speaking, then went to his supplies. This time he prepared a proper meal: Johnny cakes from cornmeal, more venison, and even a precious spoonful of molasses for James. "Thank you," Margaret said as they ate. Josiah paused in his chewing, looking at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. Then he resumed eating, dismissing her gratitude. After breakfast, he stood before her, his presence filling the small space. "You know what I said last night, what I claimed." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "I remember. Mountain law is different than your town law. A man takes a woman. She's his until he says otherwise. You understand?" She lifted her chin, meeting his wild gaze. "I understand you saved our lives. I understand my son needs shelter and food. Beyond that." She let the words trail off, her meaning clear. Something flickered in Josiah's eyes. Respect, perhaps, for her courage. "You'll work for your keep. Cooking, mending, keeping the fire. Try to run, and I'll track you down before you get a mile. Clear?" "Clear." He nodded once, then began showing her around the cabin's workings, where he stored supplies, how to bank the fire to last through the night, which pelts were for trading and which for warmth. His manner was brusque, businesslike, as if she were a hired hand rather than a captive. Days passed in this strange new rhythm. Josiah left each morning to check his trap lines, returning with rabbits, beaver, sometimes a deer. Margaret cooked, cleaned, mended his clothes with supplies he provided. James, resilient as only children could be, began to explore the cabin, asking endless questions about the pelts and tools. On the fourth night, a blizzard struck. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow through every tiny gap in the walls. Josiah worked tirelessly, stuffing cracks with moss, securing the door with an extra bar. The temperature dropped so severely that ice formed on the inside walls. "Mama, I'm cold," James whimpered from his furs. Margaret added another pelt, but the boy continued shivering. She looked helplessly at Josiah, who sat sharpening his knife by the fire. Without a word, he rose and rearranged the sleeping spaces, dragging all the furs into one large pile before the fireplace. "We sleep here tonight, all of us. Body heat keeps us alive." Margaret stiffened, but the practical truth of his words was undeniable. She settled James in the middle of the furs, then lay beside him. Josiah stretched out on the boy's other side, his massive frame like a wall against the cold. In the flickering firelight, with the storm raging outside, their strange arrangement felt almost natural. James, warm between them, fell asleep quickly. Margaret lay awake, acutely aware of the man's presence, of the necessity that had driven them to this intimacy. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked softly. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Easier than living with people." "Were you always alone?" "No." The word came out harsh, final. But after another silence, he continued, "Had a cabin in Wyoming once, smaller than this. Had people there." He didn't elaborate, and Margaret didn't press. She understood loss, understood how it could drive someone to seek solitude in the wilderness. They lay in silence, listening to the storm, bound together by necessity, and the small boy sleeping peacefully between them. When morning came, the blizzard had passed, leaving the world buried under fresh snow. Josiah dug them out, then went to check his traps. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching him disappear into the white wilderness, and realized with a start that she no longer thought of trying to escape. Where would she go? How would she survive? And James? She looked at her son, rosy-cheeked and laughing as he played with a carved wooden bear Josiah had silently left by his furs. James was thriving here in a way he never had on their desperate journey west. That evening, Josiah returned with a deer, as he butchered it outside. Margaret watched through the window. He worked with efficient grace, wasting nothing. When he caught her watching, she expected anger. Instead, he motioned her outside. "You need to learn," he said simply, "case something happens to me." So she stood in the cold, watching as he showed her how to skin and butcher, how to separate meat for eating from meat for preserving. Her hands grew bloody, her stomach turned, but she forced herself to learn. This was survival. This was their life now. That night, as they ate fresh venison steaks, James looked up at Josiah with bright eyes. "Can you teach me to trap rabbits?" Josiah studied the boy for a long moment. "You're small." "I'm strong." James flexed his tiny arm. Margaret saw something shift in Josiah's weathered face. Not quite a smile, but a softening. "Maybe, when the snow melts some." James beamed, and Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. They were captives. Yes, their situation was impossible by any civilized standard, but they were alive, warm, fed. In this frozen wilderness, perhaps that was enough. As she tucked James into his furs that night, he whispered, "I like it here. Mama, Mister, Josiah is teaching me things." Margaret smoothed his hair, her heart full of conflicting emotions. Through the cabin's dim light, she could see Josiah at his usual spot by the fire, carving another wooden figure. This one looked like a bird. "Sleep now, little one," she murmured. "Tomorrow will bring what it brings." But as she settled into her own bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, the fire crackling, the wind sighing through the pines, Josiah's knife scraping against wood, Margaret realized that fear no longer gripped her as it had that first night. Something else was taking its place, something she didn't yet have words for. Outside, wolves howled in the distance, but the sound no longer seemed threatening. They were simply part of this world now, this strange existence she and James had fallen into. And at the center of it all was Josiah Reed, mountain man, captor, protector, mystery. Margaret closed her eyes, pulling the furs up to her chin, and let sleep take her into dreams of spring. Winter tightened its grip on the mountains like a fist. Each day brought fresh challenges, wood to split despite frozen hands, water to haul from the stream before it iced over completely, endless repairs to keep the cruel wind at bay. Margaret's soft hands grew calloused, her back strong from constant work. She learned to read the weather and the movement of clouds, to gauge the temperature by the sound of snow beneath her boots. Josiah proved to be a patient teacher, though his methods were harsh as the land itself. When Margaret struggled to start a fire with damp wood, he let her fail repeatedly before showing her how to find dry kindling beneath the snow-covered logs. When she burned their supper, he ate it without complaint but made her cook the next meal under his watchful eye until she got it right. "Crying won't keep you warm," he said one morning when she wept from frustration after dropping their water bucket, spilling precious liquid across the frozen ground. "Fetch another, and another after that if need be." But for all his sternness, Margaret began to see the careful thought behind his actions. He always ensured they had more firewood than needed, knowing that injury or storms could trap them inside for days. He taught James to whittle, giving the boy tasks that kept him occupied and warm by the fire. And though he never spoke of it, Margaret noticed that the choicest cuts of meat always found their way to her and James's bowls. One gray afternoon, while Josiah was checking his distant trap lines, Margaret decided to organize the chaos of supplies in the cabin. Behind sacks of flour, she discovered a wooden trunk, its lock long broken. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were remnants of another life: a woman's dress, faded blue with tiny flowers, a child's shoes, barely worn, a daguerreotype of a young woman with kind eyes, and a small boy on her lap. At the bottom, a Bible with names written in careful script: Josiah Reed and Mary Reed, joined in holy matrimony, June 12, 1867. Samuel Reed, born March 3, 1868. Margaret stared at the photograph, understanding flooding through her like cold water. This wild man, this creature of the mountains, had once been a husband, a father, had once lived in civilization with a family of his own. She carefully rewrapped everything and returned the trunk to its hiding place, but the knowledge stayed with her. That evening, as they ate their simple meal, she found herself studying Josiah with new eyes, beneath the beard and scars, beneath the wildness that had claimed him. She could almost see the man he'd been. "Mr. Josiah," James piped up, breaking the silence. "Will you teach me to read the tracks like you do?" Josiah looked at the boy, and Margaret caught a flash of something raw in his eyes. "Snow's got to be right for tracking. Too soft and it won't hold sign. Too hard and nothing marks it. How do you know when it's right? You learn. Time and watching. You learn." James nodded solemnly, as if receiving great wisdom. "I'll watch real good." "Well," Margaret corrected gently, "you'll watch very well." Josiah's eyes shifted to her. Boy needs to learn mountain talk if he's going to live in the mountains. He also needs to learn proper grammar if he's ever going to— She stopped, realizing what she'd been about to say. If he's ever going to return to civilization. But would they? Could they? An uncomfortable silence fell. Josiah stood abruptly, taking his rifle. "Storm coming. Need to check the shelter roof." After he left, James looked at Margaret with worried eyes. "Did I make Mr. Josiah angry? No, sweet boy. Adults sometimes have complicated thoughts, that's all." That night, the storm Josiah had predicted arrived with a vengeance. Wind shrieked through the valley like a banshee, driving snow horizontal. The cabin groaned under the assault, and drafts found every tiny gap in the walls. Margaret woke to find the fire nearly dead and the cabin growing dangerously cold. She struggled to add wood, but the wind down the chimney kept blowing smoke back into the room. Her eyes streamed as she fought to keep the flames alive. Strong hands suddenly moved her aside. Josiah, who she hadn't heard enter, quickly adjusted the damper and rebuilt the fire with practiced efficiency. Soon, warmth began creeping back into the room. "Why didn't you wake me?" Margaret asked, coughing from the smoke. "You were learning," he said simply. "I could have let the fire die. We could have frozen. But you didn't, and you won't make the same mistake again." There was a strange logic to his methods. She realized he was teaching her to survive not through gentle instruction but through necessity itself. Every hard lesson carved itself into her memory in a way no amount of telling could achieve. The storm raged for 3 days, confined to the cabin. Their small world grew even smaller. Josiah worked on his traps, mending and adjusting springs with infinite patience. Margaret sewed, turning scraps of fur and hide into mittens for James. The boy alternated between playing with his carved animals and pestering Josiah with questions about the wilderness. On the second night, with the wind howling its loudest, James asked, "Mr. Josiah, why don't you have any children?" Margaret's needle paused. She saw Josiah's hands still on the trap he was working. "Had a boy once," he said quietly, "about your size." James, with the innocent directness of childhood, asked, "Where is he now?" "Gone. Him and his ma both. Fever took them 8 winters back." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken grief. Margaret wanted to offer comfort, but knew instinctively that Josiah would reject it. Instead, she continued her sewing, letting the quiet acknowledge what words could not. "I'm sorry," James said solemnly. "My papa's gone too. Bad men shot him." Josiah looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small piece of antler. "See here? Elk shed these every winter. Gonna show you how to carve something from it. Something special." As Margaret watched the large man guide her son's small hands in holding the knife, teaching him to work with the grain of the antler, her heart constricted with an emotion she didn't want to name. This man who claimed ownership of her, who lived by mountain law rather than civilized codes, was showing her son a tenderness she hadn't expected. When the storm finally broke, they emerged to a world transformed. Snow lay chest-deep in the clearing, with drifts reaching nearly to the cabin's roof. Trees had fallen under the weight of ice, and the familiar landscape had become alien. "We'll need meat," Josiah announced, surveying the damage. "Storm like this drives the elk down to the valleys. Good hunting, but dangerous travel." "I want to come," James said eagerly. "Too deep for you, boy." "You'd disappear in the first drift." Margaret saw her son's disappointment and felt her own matching worry. Josiah would be gone perhaps days in this weather, leaving them alone, as if reading her thoughts. Josiah spent the morning showing her things she'd need to know: how to clear the chimney if it blocked, where he kept the emergency supplies, how to bar the door properly against more than just wind. "If I'm not back in 4 days, take the boy and follow the creek down. It'll lead you to the valley eventually. There's a trading post where the creek meets the river. Tell them Josiah Reed sent you. They'll see you safe to Cedar Falls." "You're coming back," Margaret said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. He looked at her strangely. "Planning on it, but mountains don't always care about plans." He left at dawn the next day, disappearing into the white wilderness with his rifle and pack. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching until she could no longer distinguish his form from the shadows of the trees. The cabin felt empty without his presence. She hadn't realized how much space he occupied, not just physically, but in the very air itself. James moped by the fire, half-heartedly playing with his carved animals. "Tell me about when you were little, Mama," he said that evening as they ate their simple meal. So Margaret told him about Ohio, about houses with proper windows and churches with bells that rang on Sundays, about his father's shop where he'd made furniture that people came from 3 counties away to buy, about apple orchards in spring and barn dances in summer. "Will we go back there?" James asked. Margaret looked around the cabin, at the rough walls that kept out the killing cold, at the furs that warmed them, at the supplies that fed them, at her own hands, no longer soft but capable and strong. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Would you want to?" James considered this seriously. "I like it here. Mr. Josiah is teaching me important things, and there aren't any bad men." From the mouths of babes, Margaret thought. Here in this wilderness that should have terrified her. She felt safer than she had on the traveled roads with their bandits and dangers. On the 3rd night, she woke to scratching sounds outside the cabin. Her heart hammered as she remembered Josiah's warnings about wolves and worse. The scratching came again, followed by a low whine. Against her better judgment, Margaret peered through a crack in the door. A wolf sat in the snow, but something was wrong. It held one paw awkwardly, and even in the moonlight, she could see the dark stain of blood on the snow. "Fool creature," she whispered, but something in its patient suffering moved her. She gathered some scraps of meat they could spare and opened the door just wide enough to toss them out. The wolf limped forward, gulping the food before retreating to the forest edge. When Josiah returned the next day, dragging a makeshift sled loaded with elk meat, Margaret told him about the wolf. Probably caught in someone's trap and chewed free, he said, but there was approval in his voice. You did right. Wounded wolf near the cabin could bring the pack. Better to send it on its way fed. As they worked together to butcher and preserve the elk, Margaret felt the rhythm of their partnership. She knew without asking what tools he needed, could anticipate his movements. When their hands accidentally touched, passing the knife between them, neither pulled away immediately. That night, warm and fed, with James asleep in his furs, Margaret found herself watching Josiah as he carved by the fire. The harsh planes of his face had become familiar, the wild tangle of his beard no longer frightening but simply part of him. Thank you, she said quietly, for teaching him, for... She gestured helplessly at the cabin, the food, their survival. He looked up from his carving, those dark eyes studying her. Boy needs a man's teaching. You need providing for. It's practical. But she heard what he didn't say. Saw it in the careful way he'd cleaned his boots before entering so as not to track snow across her newly swept floor. In the way he'd brought back not just meat, but also pine boughs that filled the cabin with fresh scent. In the patience with which he answered James's endless questions. This man who claimed her body until he had sons was, in his own way, courting her. Not with flowers or pretty words, but with survival itself. Teaching her strength, showing her worth, proving his own value as provider and protector. Margaret returned to her sewing, a small smile playing at her lips. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside, their strange little family was warm and safe. Winter still gripped the mountains fiercely, but for the first time since Thomas died, Margaret felt the faint stirring of something that might have been hope. The first hints of spring came slowly to the mountains. Icicles grew longer during the day, dripping steadily before freezing again each night. The snow settled and compacted, no longer the fierce powder of deep winter, but heavy and wet. Josiah watched the signs with the intensity of a man reading scripture. Melt's coming early this year, he announced one morning. Means the passes will clear, but also means floods and slides. We'll need to move careful like. Margaret had learned to trust his weather wisdom implicitly. When he said storms were coming, they came. When he predicted clear skies, she could hang washing outside without fear. This gift of reading the land seemed as natural to him as breathing. They had fallen into a comfortable routine over the winter months. Mornings began with Josiah tending the fire while Margaret prepared breakfast. James would tumble from his furs, eager to help with whatever tasks the day brought. The boy had grown in the months since their arrival. Taller, sturdier, with a confidence born of surviving winter in the wilderness. Can we check the high traps today, Mr. Josiah? James asked over their morning meal of cornmeal mush and dried berries. You said when the snow got crusty we could go higher up. Josiah considered this, studying the boy who looked back with hopeful eyes. Might could. Your ma taught you those letters I asked her to? Yes, sir. Want to see? James jumped up, grabbing a piece of charcoal from the fire. On a flat board Josiah had smoothed for the purpose. He carefully wrote his name, then Josiah's, then Margaret's. Good, Josiah grunted. But Margaret caught the pleased glint in his eye. Man needs to read sign on paper as well as on the ground. We'll go after noon, when the sun softened the crust some. As the men, for James stood straighter when Josiah called him that, prepared for their trek, Margaret found herself fighting an unexpected anxiety. They'd been out together before, but never so far. Never where she couldn't see them from the cabin door if she climbed the big rock behind the wood pile. We'll be back before dark, Josiah said, reading her worry. Boy needs to learn the high country. It's where a man goes when the low places get too crowded. She nodded, understanding more than he probably meant to reveal. The high country was his refuge, his sanctuary. That he was sharing it with James meant something. They left after the noon meal, James practically dancing with excitement despite the snowshoes Josiah had fashioned for him. Margaret watched them go, the massive man shortening his stride to match the boys, pointing out tracks and signs as they went. The cabin felt too quiet. She threw herself into work, scrubbing the rough plank floor, mending tears in clothing, starting a stew with the last of their stored vegetables. But her mind kept wandering to them, out there in the vast white wilderness. It was late afternoon, the sun already dropping behind the western peaks, when she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze. Voices, men's voices, coming up the trail from the valley. Margaret grabbed Josiah's spare rifle, checking that it was loaded. Her hands shook as she barred the door and moved to the window. Through the thick, wavy glass, she could see them. 3 men on horseback, leading a pack mule. Their clothes marked them as drifters, the kind of men who haunted the territories looking for easy prey. They stopped in the clearing, studying the cabin. One pointed at the smoke rising from the chimney. Another gestured at the various signs of habitation. The woodpile, the stretched hides, the meat cache high in a tree. "Hello, the cabin," one called out. "Looking for hospitality. Been on the trail for days." Margaret remained silent, rifle clutched in sweating palms. Josiah had told her never to answer strangers when alone, never to reveal that the cabin's protector was absent. The men consulted among themselves, then dismounted. They approached the cabin with the casual arrogance of those used to taking what they wanted. The largest tried the door, found it barred, and laughed. "Come now, whoever's in there, we know you're home, just looking for a meal and maybe to warm ourselves by your fire. Christian charity and all that." "Christian charity is found in towns," Margaret called out, deepening her voice as much as she could. "Move along." More laughter. "That's a woman in there, boys, all alone by the sound of it?" Fear clawed at Margaret's throat, but anger burned hotter. These were the same kind of men who had killed Thomas, who thought the wilderness gave them license to take whatever they pleased. One of them moved to the window. Margaret aimed the rifle at the glass, letting him see the barrel. He jerked back, but his smile didn't fade. "Now, ma'am, no need for that. We're reasonable men. Just open the door and we can discuss this civilized-like. The only thing to discuss is how fast you can leave." Margaret replied, "My husband will return soon with our neighbors. They don't take kindly to strangers bothering womenfolk." "Husband, eh?" The leader looked around theatrically. "Don't see no sign of him. Tracks show only one man's been coming and going, and he left hours ago. Plenty of time for us to get acquainted." They knew. Somehow they'd read the signs and knew she was alone. Margaret's mind raced. The door would hold for a while, but not forever. The windows were too small for a man to fit through, but they could shoot through them. Or worse, set fire to the cabin. Then, from the forest behind the cabin, came a sound that raised the hair on her neck, a long, low wolf howl. But this was no wolf. Margaret had heard that sound before, on the night Josiah had found them. It was his warning call, telling her he was near. The men heard it too, hands moving to their guns. "What was that?" Another howl, from a different direction. Then another. The horses began to stamp nervously. "Wolves," one of the men said uneasily. "Big pack by the sound of it. Wolves don't hunt in daylight." The leader scoffed, but his voice carried less certainty. A movement in the trees caught Margaret's eye. Josiah, moving like a shadow despite his size. He'd left James somewhere safe and circled back. Their eyes met through the window, and he held up 3 fingers, then pointed at the men. She nodded, understanding. "Last warning," she called out. "Leave now, or face the consequences." The leader laughed, but it sounded forced. "You threatening us, woman!" He never finished the sentence. Josiah emerged from the forest like an avalanche, his rifle booming. The leader's hat flew off, creased by a bullet. Before the others could react, Josiah had covered the ground between them, moving with the terrible purpose of a predator. He struck the nearest man with the rifle butt, sending him sprawling. The third man went for his gun. But Josiah was on him, one massive hand closing around his throat, lifting him clear off the ground. "Touch my family," Josiah growled, his voice barely human, "and I'll gut you like deer and leave you for the ravens." The man's face turned purple. His companion, recovering from the rifle blow, scrambled for his horse. The leader, hatless and wide-eyed, backed away slowly. "We didn't know," he stammered. Thought the place was just a woman alone. Now you know different." Josiah dropped the choking man, who collapsed, gasping. "Take your friends and ride. If I see you in these mountains again, if I hear you've bothered any woman, anywhere, I'll find you. Mountain Man's promise." They fled. Margaret watched through the window as they grabbed their horses and spurred them down the trail, the pack mule braying as it was dragged along. They didn't stop or look back. Only when they were gone did Margaret realize she was shaking. She unbarred the door as Josiah approached, and something in her face must have shown her state because he stopped just outside. "You hurt?" he asked gruffly. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. The rifle dropped from her numb fingers, and suddenly she was sobbing. Great, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. All the fear, all the memories of Thomas's death, all the terror of what might have happened crashed over her at once. Strong arms enveloped her. Josiah pulled her against his chest, and she found herself clinging to him, her tears soaking into his buckskin shirt. He smelled of pine and snow and safety. "You did good," he murmured, one hand awkwardly patting her back. "Kept them talking, kept them outside. Smart woman." "I was so frightened," she gasped between sobs. "They were going to, but they didn't, and they won't." His arms tightened. "Not while I draw breath." A small voice interrupted them. "Mama, are you hurt?" Margaret pulled back to see James standing nearby, his young face creased with worry. She wiped her eyes and managed a smile. "No, sweet boy, just scared. But Josiah made the bad men go away." James nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by wrapping his small arms around Josiah's leg. "Thank you for protecting Mama." Something shifted in Josiah's weathered face. He reached down and ruffled the boy's hair with surprising gentleness. "Always, boy, always." That night, Margaret couldn't stop trembling. The cabin that had felt so safe now seemed vulnerable, its walls too thin, its door too weak. Every sound from outside made her start. Josiah, who usually retired to his chair by the fire after supper, instead spread his furs next to hers and James's. "Just for tonight," he said gruffly. "Case those fools are stupid enough to come back." But Margaret knew, and suspected he knew, that it wasn't really about the bandits. It was about the fear that had crept in, the reminder of how quickly safety could turn to danger in this wild land. She lay awake, listening to James's peaceful breathing and Josiah's deeper respirations. In the darkness, she found his hand and squeezed it. He squeezed back, a silent promise that he would stand between them and any danger. "Josiah," she whispered. Those men, one of them looked familiar. I think he might have been with the group that killed Thomas." Silence stretched between them. Then, "You want me to track them? I could catch up by dawn." The offer hung in the air. Margaret thought of Thomas, of justice, of revenge. Then she thought of James, of the life they were building here, of the man beside her who had become their protector. "No," she said finally. "Let them go. The past is the past." His hand tightened on hers. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. We have what matters here." In the darkness, she felt rather than saw him nod. They lay quietly, hands still clasped, as the night deepened around them. Outside, real wolves howled in the distance, but the sound no longer frightened her. She had her own wolf here, guardian and protector, fierce and gentle by turns. Just before sleep took her, Margaret heard Josiah speak, his voice so low she almost missed it. "Could have lost you today, both of you." A pause, heavy with unspoken emotion. "Can't happen. Won't let it happen." She wanted to respond, to tell him what his protection meant, what he was beginning to mean. But exhaustion pulled her under, and her last conscious thought was the warmth of his hand in hers. Anchor and promise combined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The men might return with others. The spring floods Josiah predicted would test them in different ways. The hard choices that had brought them together still loomed, unresolved. But tonight, in this rough cabin in the wilderness, with danger faced and overcome, They were together, a strange family forged by circumstance and hardship, bound by something stronger than convention or propriety. In the morning, they would face whatever came as they had learned to face everything, together. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, late spring's last defiance, but inside, wrapped in furs and safety and the growing bonds between them, Margaret, James, and Josiah slept peacefully, guarded by the mountains and by each other. Spring finally conquered winter, transforming the mountain landscape into a world of rushing streams and emerging green. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, revealing the earth beneath, scarred in places by avalanches, but eager for new growth. Josiah had been right about the floods. Every creek became a torrent, and the usual trails were often impassable. It was during this season of change that necessity finally drove them down to Cedar Falls. "Boy needs proper boots," Josiah announced one morning. Examining James's footwear, the child had grown considerably over the winter, and his toes pressed against the leather. "And we need supplies. Salt, flour, ammunition. Town trip can't be put off longer." Margaret's stomach clenched. She'd known this day would come, when they'd have to face civilization again. The thought of people, of their stares and whispers, made her hands tremble as she packed what few trade goods they had, pelts Josiah had trapped, her own carefully preserved herbs, some of James's carved figures that showed real skill. "Will they be mean to us, Mama?" James asked, sensing her anxiety. She smoothed his hair, grown long and wild over the winter. "Some people don't understand our ways. Sweet boy, but we'll hold our heads high." Josiah studied her with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "You don't have to come. Boy and I can. We're a family," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "We go together." Something flickered across his face, approval, perhaps, or something deeper. He nodded once, then went to prepare the horses he'd traded for with a passing trapper weeks earlier. The journey to Cedar Falls took 2 days. They camped the first night by a stream, and Margaret found herself marveling at how comfortable she'd become with outdoor living. She built the fire without thinking, cooked their meal efficiently, and helped Josiah secure the camp against predators. When had these skills become second nature? As they neared town, the signs of civilization increased: cleared fields, distant smoke from chimneys, the occasional traveler who gave them wide berth after seeing Josiah's imposing figure. Margaret unconsciously straightened her dress, worn but clean, and tried to tame her own hair beneath her bonnet. Cedar Falls hadn't grown much over the winter. The same weathered buildings lined the muddy main street. The same suspicion hung in the air like smoke. As they rode in, conversation stopped. Eyes tracked their progress: the mountain man, the woman, and the child. "That's her," Margaret heard someone whisper. "The widow Sullivan, living in sin with that wild man." Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her gaze forward. Beside her, Josiah rode relaxed and easy, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle. They stopped first at Muller's general store. The proprietor, a thin man with nervous eyes, watched them enter as if expecting trouble. "Need supplies," Josiah said without preamble, setting a bundle of prime pelts on the counter. "Fair trade." Muller examined the furs with the eye of one who knew their value. "These are fine quality, but I'm not sure I can—" "You saying my trade's no good?" Josiah's voice carried a low rumble of threat. No, of course not. It's just—" Muller glanced at Margaret, then away. "People talk, you understand. Bad for business if— Then we'll take our business elsewhere." Josiah reached for the pelts, but Muller's greed overcame his fear of gossip. "Wait, I'll trade. Just—" "Perhaps the lady and boy could wait outside?" Margaret felt the insult like a slap. Before she could respond, Josiah's hand came down on the counter with a crack that made Muller jump. "The lady shops where she pleases. You got a problem with that? We'll be moving on." Muller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "No problem. None at all. What do you need?" They conducted their business in tense silence, Margaret selecting flour, salt, coffee, and other necessities while trying to ignore Muller's disapproving glances. James, oblivious to the adult tensions, was fascinated by the jars of penny candy, though he knew better than to ask. It was as they were finishing that Mrs. Elmira Hartley swept into the store. The mayor's wife, dressed in black bombazine despite the spring warmth, took one look at Margaret and gasped dramatically. "Margaret Sullivan! How dare you show your face in decent society?" The store went silent. Margaret felt every eye upon her, felt the judgment radiating from Mrs. Hartley like heat from a stove. "I'm shopping for my family, Mrs. Hartley," Margaret said quietly. "Family?" The woman's voice rose to a near shriek. "You call that arrangement family, living in sin with this creature? What example are you setting for your poor child?" James pressed closer to Margaret's skirts. She put a protective hand on his shoulder, anger beginning to override embarrassment. "The example of survival," she said clearly, "of protection and providence, of care for those who need it, of shamelessness." Mrs. Hartley turned to the gathering crowd. "This woman's husband barely cold in his grave, and she takes up with the first man to offer. Enough!" Josiah's voice cut through her tirade like an axe through wood. He stepped forward, and Mrs. Hartley shrank back. "You know nothing of what this woman's endured, nothing of what she survived. You sit in your warm house with your soft hands and your full belly, and you dare judge her. How dare you speak to me? I speak truth." He loomed over her, every inch the wild mountain man she'd called him. This woman faced winter storms, wolves, and bandits. She's learned to hunt, trap, and survive where you die in a day. She's raised her boy strong and good. That's worth more than all your propriety. "Mrs. Hartley sputtered, but no words came. Josiah turned to Muller. "We done here?" The shopkeeper nodded rapidly, pushing their supplies across the counter. As they gathered their goods, a new voice spoke from the doorway. Now, what's all this commotion?" Reverend Paul Morrison entered, his kind face creased with concern. Unlike Mrs. Hartley, his expression held no judgment, only gentle worry. "Reverend," Mrs. Hartley immediately appealed to him. "This woman, I see Mrs. Sullivan has come to town for supplies." He interrupted mildly. "As is her right, as is anyone's right who needs provision." He approached Margaret, his voice lowering. "How are you, my dear? And young James?" "We're well, Reverend," Margaret replied, grateful for his kindness. We're surviving. More than surviving, from what I hear." His eyes twinkled. "Word is that someone left fresh venison on Widow Cooper's doorstep all winter. She'd have starved without it. Strange how it appeared just after you were seen trading pelts for extra meat." Margaret blushed. She had convinced Josiah to share their surplus with the elderly widow who lived on the town's edge. He'd grumbled but had made the deliveries under cover of darkness. And young Tim Fletcher says a mountain man taught him to set rabbit snares when his PA was laid up with a broken leg. Fed their family for weeks. Josiah shifted uncomfortably. Margaret hadn't known about that kindness. The Reverend smiled. "Seems to me that actions speak louder than appearances. Judge not, lest ye be judged, as the good book says." Mrs. Hartley huffed indignantly, but others in the crowd looked thoughtful. A few even nodded. "You're welcome in church any time," Reverend Morrison continued. "All of you. God's house has room for everyone." "Appreciate that, Reverend," Josiah said gruffly. "But the mountains are our church now." They left soon after, loading their supplies on the pack horse. As they rode out, Margaret heard the buzz of gossip resume behind them. But something had shifted. Not everyone had looked at them with condemnation. Some had shown understanding, even respect. "That was kind of the Reverend," Margaret said as they cleared the town. "Good man," Josiah agreed. "One of the few." James, who had been quiet throughout the ordeal, finally spoke. "Why was that mean lady yelling at you, Mama?" Margaret searched for words to explain prejudice to a child. Some people think there's only one right way to live, sweet boy. They don't understand that sometimes life forces us to find new ways. Our way is good, James said firmly. We help people and we take care of each other. That's what matters. From the mouths of babes. Margaret thought again. She caught Josiah looking at her with an unreadable expression. That night, camped by the same stream, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. The confrontation in town had stirred up feelings she'd tried to bury. She rose quietly and walked to where the water gurgled over stones, moonlight turning the surface to silver. Can't sleep? She didn't startle anymore when Josiah appeared silently beside her. His ability to move without sound had become familiar, comforting even. Thinking, she admitted, about what that harpy said. Despite everything, Margaret smiled at his description of Mrs. Hartley, partly, also thinking about choices, about what we are to each other. Josiah was quiet for a long moment. I told you the first night. Mountain law. I know what you said. She turned to face him. But is that still what this is? Am I still just property to you? In the moonlight, she could see the struggle on his face. This man of few words, wrestling with feelings he'd buried as deep as any winter snow. Started that way, he said finally. Needed a woman to keep house, maybe give me sons to carry on. Simple as that. But now, he trailed off, looking at the water. Margaret waited, heart pounding. Now you're Margaret, he said simply. Not the woman or property. Margaret, who feeds the hungry. Margaret, who faces down wolves and bandits. Margaret, who teaches the boy his letters and gentles my rough edges. Don't have words for what that is. Just know I'd die before letting harm come to you. Both of you. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the way of storybooks. But from this man, these words were everything. Josiah, she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. Pa, Mama! James's frightened voice cut through the moment. There's something in the woods! They rushed back to find the boy pointing at glowing eyes in the darkness. Josiah relaxed, chuckling. Just our old friend, he said. Into the firelight limped the wolf Margaret had fed months ago. Its paw had healed, though it still favored the leg. The wolf studied them calmly, then settled just outside the circle of light. He's been following us since we left the cabin, Josiah explained. Keeping pace, keeping watch. You saved his life, and now he's returning the favor. Wolf's honor. James's fear transformed to wonder. Really? He's protecting us. Wolves remember kindness, Josiah said, and they protect their pack. As they settled back into their bedrolls, the wolf maintaining its vigil, Margaret felt a profound shift in her understanding. They were a pack now, not bound by law or convention, but by something wilder and perhaps stronger. The town could whisper, Mrs. Hartley could condemn, but here in the wilderness, they had found their own truth. Josiah? She whispered in the darkness. Thank you for defending me today, for everything. His hand found hers across the space between their bedrolls. Always, Margaret, always. The wolf sang softly to the moon, a lonely sound that wasn't lonely at all. It was a calling out to kin, a declaration of belonging, and wrapped in her blankets, hand clasped in the hand of this rough, gentle man, with her son safe beside them and their guardian keeping watch. Margaret finally understood what home meant. The weeks after their town visit passed in a blur of spring work. The mountain streams ran full with snowmelt, making it perfect for panning the small amount of gold that washed down from higher elevations. Josiah taught Margaret and James the patience of sifting through countless pans of gravel for the occasional glimmer of color. It wasn't much, but it would help with next winter's supplies. Then came the morning when everything changed. Margaret woke to find James burning with fever. His small body shook with chills, even as sweat beaded on his forehead. The illness had come suddenly. He'd been fine the night before, helping Josiah repair the chicken coop they'd built. James, sweet boy, can you hear me? She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. fear clawing at her chest. Josiah appeared at her shoulder, his face grave as he felt the boy's pulse. Fever's high. Could be mountain fever. Could be something else. He needs medicine. We have willow bark, and I know some herbs. Not enough. Josiah was already reaching for his coat. Doc Morrison in town will have what's needed. I'll go. I'm coming with you. He shook his head. Someone needs to stay with the boy. Keep him cool. Get water in him if he'll take it. I'll be back by nightfall. Margaret wanted to argue, but James moaned softly, and she knew Josiah was right. Ride fast, she whispered. He paused at the door, looking back at them. Take care of our boy, he said, and was gone before Margaret could process that he'd said our. The day passed in a haze of worry. Margaret bathed James with cool water, spooned willow bark tea between his lips, whispered prayers and stories and pleas for him to fight. The fever raged on, undeterred by her efforts. By afternoon, he was delirious, calling for his papa, for Josiah, for people she didn't know. The sun was setting when she heard horses, not one, but several. Her heart leaped. Had Josiah brought the doctor? She rushed to the door to see Josiah dismounting, followed by Reverend Morrison and, surprisingly, Doc Morrison himself, a gruff man who rarely left town. Where's the boy? Doc Morrison asked without preamble, his medical bag in hand. Margaret led him inside, hovering anxiously as he examined James. The doctor's face was unreadable as he checked the child's pulse, looked at his throat, felt his lymph nodes. Mountain fever, sure enough, he announced. Seen it before. Next 2 days are critical. He pulled out bottles from his bag quinine, laudanum for the pain. Other medicines Margaret didn't recognize. As he worked, mixing doses and instructing Margaret on their administration, Reverend Morrison spoke quietly with Josiah. This is why I came, Margaret heard the Reverend say. The boy needs more than medicine. He needs community, stability. You can't raise a child in isolation. We're doing fine, Josiah growled. Are you? What happens the next time he's sick and the passes are snowed in? What about his education, his future? The Reverend's voice was gentle but insistent. I'm not saying you need to live in town, but the boy needs to be part of civilization, at least partly. Margaret listened while appearing focused on James. The Reverend was voicing fears she'd pushed down all winter. Could they really raise James entirely in the wilderness? Was it fair to him? Doc Morrison finished his ministrations. Give him these doses through the night. If the fever breaks by morning, he'll likely pull through. If not, he didn't finish. Thank you for coming, Margaret said, her voice thick with unshed tears. The doctor studied her with sharp eyes. You've changed, Mrs. Sullivan. Harder, but not in a bad way. Mountain life agrees with you, even if the town biddies don't. As they prepared to leave, Reverend Morrison took Margaret's hands. I meant what I said in town. You're welcome in church, all of you. And I run a small school 3 days a week. James would be welcome there too, when he's well. After they left, Margaret and Josiah maintained their vigil. They took turns bathing James with cool water, spooning medicine between his lips, watching for any sign of improvement. The wolf, their silent guardian, appeared at the cabin door and settled on the porch, as if he too were keeping watch. Near midnight, James's fever spiked higher. He thrashed in his blankets, crying out incoherently. Margaret held him while Josiah prepared another dose of medicine, but the boy fought them, lost in his delirium. Papa, James cried out. Papa, don't leave me. Margaret's heart broke. I'm here, sweet boy. Mama's here. But James twisted away from her, reaching for Josiah. Pa! Want Pa! Josiah froze, the medicine bottle trembling in his large hands. Margaret saw the raw emotion flash across his face before he carefully set down the bottle and gathered James into his arms. I'm here, boy, he said roughly. Pa's here. You fight this thing, you hear me? You're strong. You're a mountain boy now. James settled at his voice, allowing them to give him the medicine. Josiah held him, rocking slightly, and began to speak in a low rumble, Stories of the mountains, of bears and wolves and eagles, of brave boys who grew up to be strong men, of families bound not by blood, but by choice. Margaret watched them, tears streaming down her face. This wild man who'd claimed her in desperation had become a father to her son. And James, who'd lost one father to violence, had found another in the most unlikely place. The night wore on. They moved James to the big bed, both of them lying beside him to monitor his breathing, his temperature. Josiah's hand found Margaret's across the small body between them. "He'll make it," Josiah said, and Margaret couldn't tell if it was statement or prayer. "He has to?" she whispered back. Dawn came pale and uncertain. Margaret woke from a light doze to find James's forehead cooler, his breathing easier. The fever had broken. "Thank God," she breathed, fresh tears coming. Josiah's eyes were suspiciously wet as well. "Tough boy. Knew he was." James opened his eyes, clear for the first time in 2 days. "Mama? Pa?" "We're here," Margaret said, smoothing his hair. "We're both here." James smiled weakly and drifted back to sleep. But it was a healing sleep now, not the restless unconsciousness of fever. Later, as Margaret prepared a light broth for when James woke, Josiah stood by the window, looking out at the mountains. "The Reverend was right," he said suddenly, "about some things." Margaret paused in her stirring. "Oh." "Boy needs learning, needs other children sometimes. Can't keep him caged here like some wild thing." He turned to her. Maybe we could build closer to town, still in the mountains, but close enough for school, for doctoring when needed." "Leave the cabin?" "Not leave. Keep it for hunting, for when we need the high country. But build something new, something that's ours from the start." Margaret set down the spoon and went to him. "You'd do that? Give up some of your wilderness?" He cupped her face in one large hand. "For the boy. For you. Family makes a man do things he never thought he would." "Is that what we are? Family? What else would you call it?" He gestured to James sleeping peacefully in the bed. "He calls me Pa. You—" He stopped, struggling again with words. "What am I? Josiah?" she asked softly. "Everything," he said simply. "You're everything." She rose on her toes and kissed him then. Their first real kiss. It was gentle and fierce at once, tasting of tears and promises and the wild sweetness of found love. When they broke apart, Josiah rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said roughly. "Not for mountain law or sons or any of that foolishness. Marry me because I can't imagine these mountains without you in them. Because the boy needs proper parents. Because I—" He swallowed hard. "Because I love you. Margaret Sullivan." Margaret's heart soared. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Josiah Reed. I'll marry you." From the bed, a small voice piped up. "Does this mean Mr. Josiah is really my PA now?" They turned to find James watching them with bright eyes. Margaret laughed through her tears. "How long have you been awake, little spy?" "Long enough," James said with a weak grin. "Can we have a real wedding, with cake? Biggest cake in the territory," Josiah promised, ruffling the boy's hair. Over the next days, as James recovered, they made plans. Josiah knew of a valley only 2 hours from town, with good water and shelter from the worst winds. They could build there, create a home that bridged both worlds, the wildness Josiah needed and the community Margaret and James deserved. "We'll go to town next week," Margaret decided. "Talk to Reverend Morrison about a wedding, and about James starting school in the fall. The town gossips will have plenty to say." Josiah warned. "Let them talk," Margaret said firmly. "We know our truth." That evening, as James slept peacefully and the wolf sang to the rising moon, Margaret and Josiah sat on the porch planning their future. The mountains rose around them, eternal and sheltering. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. No more talk of bodies belonging or sons owed. Margaret said quietly, "We choose each other freely. Freely and fully." Josiah agreed. though I wouldn't mind a daughter or two, if God sees fit." Margaret blushed but smiled. "We'll see what comes." They sat in comfortable silence, hands entwined, watching the stars emerge. The journey that had begun in desperate flight and wild claims had led them here, to this moment of perfect understanding. "I have something for you," Josiah said suddenly. He went inside and returned with a small wooden box. Inside, on a bed of soft doeskin, lay a ring carved from elk antler, inlaid with a thin band of gold, some of their precious Pan treasure. "It's not fancy," he said uncertainly, "but I made it myself." "It's perfect," Margaret breathed, sliding it onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." As if in benediction, the wolf padded up onto the porch and settled at their feet, accepting the small family as his pack. The mountains held them all, man, woman, child, and guardian, in their ancient embrace. They would face more challenges. There would be floods and droughts, harsh winters and lean times. The town would test them, and the wilderness would continue to demand its price. But they would face it all together, bound by choice and love and the strange magic of a life carved from the wild heart of the mountains. For now, though, they simply sat together, planning a wedding and a home and a future that none of them could have imagined when winter first drove them together. The stars wheeled overhead. The wolf dozed at their feet, and in his bed, James smiled in his sleep, dreaming of cake and new beginnings. The valley Josiah had chosen lay cradled between two ridges, where a clear stream wound through meadow grass and aspens whispered in the constant mountain breeze. It was close enough to town that the journey wouldn't be treacherous in winter, yet far enough that the wildness Josiah needed still sang in every bird call and wolf howl. They began building in early summer, working from dawn to dusk. Josiah had traded furs for lumber and supplies, and several men from town, surprising allies, came to help raise the walls. Doc Morrison's son, Samuel, worked alongside them, as did Tom Fletcher, whose family Josiah had helped feed through the winter. "Never thought I'd see Josiah Reed building so close to civilization," Tom joked as they fitted logs together. Love must have softened that wild heart. Josiah grunted, but Margaret caught his slight smile. Love had softened him, but like leather worked with oil, it had made him more supple, not weaker. The cabin grew day by day, larger than their mountain refuge, with real glass windows and a wooden floor. Margaret insisted on a separate room for James, and Josiah added a small workspace where he could prepare his pelts without filling the main house with the smell. James, fully recovered from his illness, threw himself into helping. He carried tools, held boards, and chattered constantly about everything he would do in his new home. The wolf, who had taken to following them between the two cabins, watched the proceedings with intelligent eyes, occasionally padding over to inspect their work. "What will we call him?" James asked one day, scratching the wolf behind its ears. The animal, once so wild, now tolerated the boy's gentle touches. "He's not ours to name," Josiah said. "Wild things choose their own paths. But he chose us," James insisted. "That makes him family." Margaret smiled at the boy's logic. Everything in James's world was becoming family. The wolf, the mountains, even the horses, his capacity for love, undimmed by loss, constantly amazed her. 2 weeks before the wedding, Margaret made another trip to town, this time with joy rather than trepidation. She needed fabric for a dress, supplies for the ceremony, and, most importantly, to meet with Reverend Morrison about the service. The town's reaction to news of their impending marriage was mixed. Mrs. Hartley and her circle sniffed their disapproval, but others seemed genuinely pleased. Mrs. Muller, the shopkeeper's wife, even offered to help with the dress. "About time that man made an honest woman of you," she said, pinning fabric. "Though between you and me, you've been more honest than most from the start, taking care of your boy, surviving the winter. That's worth more than all the propriety in the world." Margaret felt a warmth at the unexpected support. Perhaps she and Josiah weren't as isolated as she'd feared. The wedding day dawned clear and bright. They held the ceremony in the meadow near their new cabin, with the mountains as witness. Margaret wore her new dress, simple blue cotton, but clean and pretty. Josiah had trimmed his beard and donned his least patched shirt. James stood between them, beaming with pride. The gathering was small but sincere. Reverend Morrison officiated, his words about love forged in hardship carrying extra weight. Doc Morrison and his family attended, as did the Fletchers and several others who had come to respect the unusual couple. Even a few trappers Josiah knew emerged from the wilderness, looking uncomfortable in their clean clothes, but determined to honor their friend. "Do you, Josiah Reed, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Morrison asked. "I do," Josiah said, his voice strong and certain. "Before God and these mountains, I do." "And do you, Margaret Sullivan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Margaret looked into Josiah's eyes, seeing there the wildness that would never fully fade, the gentleness he showed only to her and James, the strength that had saved them all. "I do," she said clearly, "with all my heart, I do." When they kissed, James cheered. The guests applauded, and somewhere in the forest, a wolf howled, not mournful, but triumphant. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. They'd roasted venison and made corn cakes, and, true to Josiah's promise, there was cake, a luxury Mrs. Fletcher had insisted on providing. As the sun set, painting the mountains gold and crimson, the guests gradually departed, leaving the new family alone. "Is it different?" James asked as they sat on the porch of their new home. "Being married?" Margaret and Josiah exchanged glances. In truth, they'd been living as married for months. But something had shifted with the speaking of vows, the public declaration of their bond. "It's like the difference between a trail and a road." Josiah said finally, "Both get you where you're going, but a road says, this way's established, this way endures." James nodded solemnly, filing away this wisdom. Then, with the quicksilver change of childhood, he asked, "Can I go show Gray the cake before bed?" Gray was what he'd taken to calling the wolf, despite Josiah's insistence that wild things shouldn't be named. Margaret smiled. "Just a small piece, and don't go past the tree line." As the boy ran off, Margaret leaned into Josiah's solid warmth. "Mrs. Margaret Reed," she murmured. "It sounds strange. Sounds right to me," he replied, pulling her closer. "Been right since the day you fought to keep that fire going in the storm. Knew then you were mountain strong." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. James would start school soon. They needed to finish the barn before winter, and there was always the endless work of survival. But tonight, they were simply a family, complete and content. James returned, the wolf padding silently beside him. "Gray liked the cake," he announced. "And look," he held up a perfect arrowhead, napped from black obsidian. "I found this by the stream. Do you think it's old?" Josiah examined it with interest. "Very old. Shoshone, maybe, or Crow. These mountains have seen many peoples come and go. Will we go too someday?" "No," Margaret said firmly. "This is our home now. We're part of these mountains, just like that arrowhead." As they prepared for bed in their new home, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From desperate flight through winter storms to this warm cabin filled with love. It seemed like a lifetime, though barely a year had passed. That night, as she lay beside her husband, "How wonderful to think that word," she whispered. "Josiah, are you happy?" He was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, "Spent 8 years alone in these mountains. Thought I was content. Thought the wilderness was all I needed." His arm tightened around her. "I was a fool. This, you, the boy, even that fool wolf. This is what I was waiting for without knowing it." Margaret smiled in the darkness. "No more talk of sons owed or bodies claimed?" "Well," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Wouldn't mind working on those sons, or daughters, but freely given and freely received, as you said." She laughed softly. mindful of James sleeping in his new room. Perhaps we're already working on that. Josiah went very still. Margaret? Are you saying? It's early yet, but I think so. The new cabin might have another occupant come spring. His hand splayed across her stomach, protective already. A baby. Our baby. Are you pleased? For answer, he kissed her deeply, pouring all his joy and wonder into the connection. When they broke apart, he said roughly, "Never thought I'd have this again. Family, home, future. You've given me back my life, Margaret." "We gave each other back our lives," she corrected. "That's what love does." Outside, the wolf sang to the moon, and the mountains listened. Inside, a family slept peacefully, dreaming of babies and gardens and years of joy to come. The cabin walls, built with love and determination, stood strong against the night wind. In the morning, James would go to school for the first time, nervous but excited. Josiah would check his trap lines, always the provider. Margaret would tend her new garden, coaxing life from the mountain soil. They would work and laugh and sometimes struggle, but always together. The transformation was complete. A desperate widow, a wild mountain man, and a frightened child had become something new, a family forged by hardship but defined by love. The mountains had tested them with winter and wolves, with hunger and fear. They had emerged not just survivors, but victors. As Margaret drifted towards sleep, she thought of Thomas, her first husband. She hoped he would understand, would approve of the man raising a son. Love came in many forms, she'd learned, sometimes gentle and expected, sometimes wild and demanding as a winter storm. Her hand found Josiah's in the darkness, their fingers intertwining. Outside, the wolf settled on the porch, keeping watch. The mountains stood eternal, cradling their small light of human happiness. "Thank you," she whispered. "To Josiah, to God, to the mountains themselves." "For what?" Josiah murmured, half asleep. "For the storm that brought me to you. For everything." His hand squeezed hers. Always, Margaret, always and forever. And in the peaceful darkness of their new home, surrounded by the vast wilderness that had brought them together, Margaret Reed finally, fully, believed in forever. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the northern peaks with a fury that reminded Margaret of their first desperate flight through the mountains. But now, safe in their sturdy cabin with split wood stacked high and the root cellar full, she watched the snow fall with contentment rather than fear. Her belly had grown round with new life, and Josiah had become almost comically protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy work, wouldn't let her venture far from the cabin, and checked on her constantly with worried eyes. "I'm not made of glass," Margaret told him one morning as he tried to prevent her from carrying the water bucket. "Mountain women are strong, remember? You taught me that." But she smiled as she said it, warmed by his concern. This wild man who had once seemed so frightening now fussed over her like a mother hen. James had taken to school with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything. 3 days a week, Josiah or Margaret would take him to town, where he devoured lessons and made friends with other children. His teacher, Miss Catherine Barnes, reported that he was bright and eager, if sometimes a bit too fond of sharing wilderness tales during arithmetic. "He told the class about training a wolf," Miss Barnes said one afternoon, trying to hide her smile. The other children were quite impressed, though I'm not sure they believed him. "It's true," James piped up. "Gray knows lots of tricks now. Want to see?" The wolf had indeed become even more integrated into their family life. He slept on the porch most nights, followed James on his safer adventures, and had even saved their chickens from a fox. Josiah still insisted the animal was wild, but Margaret had caught him more than once sharing his dinner with their four-legged guardian. One evening in deep winter, as snow piled against the windows and the wind howled its familiar song, they heard the desperate pounding on their door. Josiah grabbed his rifle while Margaret pulled James close. Memories of bandits flooding back. "Please," a voice called. Please help us. My wife, the baby's coming. Josiah cautiously opened the door to reveal a young couple, the man supporting a woman heavy with child. Snow covered them both, and the woman's face was twisted with pain. Our wagon broke down, the man gasped. She started her labors. Please, we saw your smoke. Without hesitation, Margaret took charge. Bring her in. Josiah. Stoke the fire. James. Heat water. They learned the couple's names were Robert and Emily Watson, heading to Oregon when weather and fate intervened. Emily's labor was progressing fast, and there was no time to fetch Doc Morrison from town. Margaret had helped with births before, back in Ohio, but never without a midwife or doctor present. Still, she knew what needed to be done. She sent the men and James to the far side of the cabin and set about helping Emily through her travail. The storm raged as new life fought to enter the world. Margaret coached Emily through each pain, drew on every scrap of knowledge she possessed, and prayed harder than she had since that desperate flight through the snow. I can't, Emily gasped between contractions. I can't do this. You can, Margaret said firmly. You're stronger than you know. Mountain strong. Now push. Hours passed. The men kept the fire blazing and the water hot. James, wide-eyed but determined to help, brought clean cloths and held the lantern steady. And finally, as dawn broke gray through the storm, a baby's cry pierced the air. A daughter, Margaret announced, cleaning the infant and wrapping her in soft flannel. Perfect and healthy. Emily wept as she held her child, and Robert's eyes were suspiciously wet. Even Josiah seemed moved. His usual stoic expression softened. What will you call her? James asked, peering at the tiny face. Emily looked at Margaret with gratitude. Hope, she said. Hope Margaret Watson, after the woman who brought her safely into this world. They stayed 3 days while Emily recovered and the storm passed. Robert proved handy with tools, helping Josiah repair their broken wagon. Emily, despite her exhaustion, insisted on helping with cooking and mending. James was fascinated by baby Hope, asking constant questions about when his new brother or sister would arrive. Soon, Margaret told him, hand on her own swelling belly. Spring, most likely. When the Watsons finally left, wagon repaired and supplied with food for their journey, Margaret felt a bittersweet pang. In just 3 days, they'd become like family. You'll write? Emily asked, clutching Margaret's hands. Let us know when your baby comes. Of course, and you'll let us know when you're settled in Oregon. As they watched the wagon disappear down the valley, Josiah put his arm around Margaret. You did good. Real good. I was terrified, she admitted. What if something had gone wrong? But it didn't. You knew what to do when it mattered. He paused, then added quietly, You'll know what to do when our time comes too. The rest of winter passed peacefully. The wolf pack howled in the distance, but Gray always answered from the porch, as if telling them this territory was protected. James excelled at school and came home full of stories and questions. Margaret nested, preparing tiny clothes and blankets, while Josiah carved a cradle with infinite care. One night, as spring began to hint at its arrival, Margaret woke to wetness and cramping. She'd been having false pains for days, but this was different. Josiah, she whispered. It's time. He was instantly alert, lighting lanterns and stoking the fire. I'll ride for Doc Morrison. No. She gripped his hand as another pain rolled through her. Too late for that, and I need you here. His face paled. Margaret, I don't know nothing about birthing babies. You know about being strong when I need you. That's enough. James woke to the commotion, but Margaret sent him to stay with the Fletchers, their nearest neighbors. He went reluctantly, with Gray as escort, promising to be good. Labor was harder than Margaret remembered, perhaps because she was older now, or perhaps because the stakes felt so much higher. This child was the seal on their new life, the fruition of love found in the wilderness. Josiah never left her side. His large hands were gentle as he supported her, his voice steady as he talked her through the pains. He'd delivered calves and foals, he reminded her, though they both knew this was vastly different. "You're the strongest woman I know," he said as she struggled through a particularly hard contraction. "You survived bandits and blizzards and wolves. You tamed a wild man and made him want to live again. You can do this." His faith gave her strength. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the peaks gold and rose, Margaret brought their child into the world with a final, mighty effort. "A son," Josiah said in wonder, his hands trembling as he held the squalling infant. "We have a son." Margaret laughed through her exhaustion. "Your son, as you once demanded, though freely given, as we agreed. Our son," he corrected, placing the baby in her arms. "Samuel Thomas Reed, for those we lost and what we found." The baby quieted at his mother's touch, peering up with unfocused eyes. Margaret traced his features, Josiah's strong brow, her delicate nose, a perfect blend of both. When James returned that afternoon, he approached the baby with the same careful respect he showed wild creatures. "He's so small," he whispered. "Was I ever that small?" "Even smaller," Margaret assured him. "But you grew strong, just like Samuel will. I'll teach him everything," James promised solemnly. "About tracking and fishing and reading, I'll be the best big brother ever." That evening, as the family gathered around the fire, Margaret in bed with the baby, Josiah in his chair with James on his lap, Gray curled by the door, a sense of completion filled the cabin. They had traveled such a long, difficult road to reach this moment. "I was thinking," Josiah said quietly, "about what brought us all here, the hard times, the losses, the fear. Without all that, we'd never have found each other." "God works in mysterious ways," Margaret murmured, adjusting Samuel's blanket. "Or maybe the mountains do," Josiah suggested. "They test folks, break them down, see what they're really made of. We passed the test." James yawned hugely. "Tell the story again, Pa, about how you found us in the snow." So Josiah told the tale, though James knew it by heart. How a desperate woman and frightened child had appeared in a blizzard. How a wild man's demand had become a family's foundation. How love had grown in the most unlikely soil. As he spoke, Margaret nursed the baby, peace filling her heart. Outside, spring crept across the land, melting snow and awakening seeds. Their garden would grow lush this year. Nourished by mountain soil and tended with love, James would help. Chattering about school while he pulled weeds, Samuel would lie in a basket nearby, watching the sky with infant wonder. "And they lived happily ever after?" James asked sleepily as the story concluded. Josiah caught Margaret's eye, and she saw there all the promises of their future. More children, perhaps. Years of partnership. The joy of watching their boys grow into men. There would be hardships. Certainly. The mountains never let anyone forget their power, but they would face whatever came together. "No," Josiah said finally. "Not happily ever after. That's for fairy tales. But they lived, really lived. With purpose and love and strength, they made a good life in a hard place, and that's better than any fairy tale." James seemed satisfied with this answer. Drifting off to sleep against his father's chest, Margaret smiled, understanding the deeper truth in Josiah's words. Their story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. Every sunrise would bring new chapters, new challenges, new joys. The wolf sang softly outside, a lullaby for the mountain family. The fire crackled its ancient comfort. And in the warmth of their cabin, built by their own hands and filled with their own love, the Reed family settled into the peaceful rhythm of their mountain life. "I love you," Margaret whispered to her husband across the dim space. "And I love you," he replied. "Until the mountains fall, until the mountains fall," she agreed. And in the cradle of the eternal peaks, under stars that had witnessed countless human dramas, their light shone small but bright, a beacon of hope proving that sometimes, from the deepest winter, comes the most beautiful spring. Thank you for listening to this story. Where are you enjoying this tale? Please share in the comments below so we can connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Margaret and Josiah's journey. Your support means everything to us.